and thank you for the invitation to come and speak at the French School of Athens. It's a great honor, and I'm going to start speaking in just a moment here. Let me just make sure that the uh, everything is working properly. So I can change the slides here. Okay, good. Yes. So I will be talking specifically about the MAMEMS project, which was just introduced, and some of the challenges and difficulties, and also successes of the project that I think could have an impact on future research on Byzantine monasticism. However, I want to talk about also some of the mechanisms for funding projects like MAMEMS, because from what I gathered talking to some of the audience members, we're not all Byzantinists. We're coming from different fields, and it might be interesting to have sort of a personal perspective on how to apply for these ERC, these European Research Council grants. So the way I've broken down my talk, it has four parts. In the first part, I will talk about these ERC grants and the advantages and disadvantages that they have, and in particular how they allow one to undertake these large research projects, also with the digital humanities component. In the second part of my talk, I'll give sort of my personal perspective on this process. So how I was able to apply for a project dealing with Mount Athos with this research funding. By the way, just as an aside, I think this was mentioned in the announcement for the talk. I have a new ERC grant about law in Eastern Christian legal traditions in the early Islamic period. I won't talk about that project. I might mention it just in passing, but the focus will be on MAMEMS, on this ERC starting grant. But if you have questions about consolidated grants, I can also talk about that. In the third part of the talk, I will talk about some of the project results. So what worked, what didn't work, what would I maybe do differently if I could start over again. And very briefly, in the final part of the talk, I just want to give some insights from the MAMEMS project, things I think that we've learned that are new or interesting that have the potential to influence future research. But before we get into MAMEMS and to Athos, let's talk about ERC grants for a few minutes. Um, I'm not sure how familiar you are with these grants, but so ERC, the European Research Council, is basically the scientific arm of the European Union and provides funding for scientific research. And coming from the American context, one thing that I very much appreciate about the ERC is that it gives an equal voice to the humanities. So it's not just the natural sciences and the hard sciences, but also the social sciences and humanities can get these high level grants. Um, and so I'm speaking here from my perspective of Byzantine studies. There haven't been that many ERC projects with the Byzantine studies focus. There have, however, been more in recent years. And I mention here on the slide two examples. The Byzantinist Christoph Erisman, he focuses on Byzantine philosophy, particularly, I think, variations of Aristotelian philosophy in the early Middle Ages. He's this bearded fellow here on the left in Vienna. He's actually received two ERC grants, a consolidator and an advanced grant. And this is the announcement from his advanced grant. And here on the right was an announcement for a consolidator grant for a comparative Byzantine Chinese project from my colleague Niels Gall in Edinburgh. So these are some recent examples of Byzantine projects that have been supported by the European Research Council. And I just wanted to mention these examples so that you can see that this isn't funding that only goes towards medieval studies or towards the hard sciences, that even sort of what we would say in German is an Orchideenfach, so a sort of a niche discipline like Byzantine studies can get grants like this. Um, just to give you a brief overview of what this funding scheme looks like, ERC grants are offered for individuals at three levels, as it were, a starting, consolidator, and advanced grant. And it depending on when you finish your PhD, you'll fit into one of these three schemes. And today I'll be talking mainly about this Athos project, MAMEMS, that was a starting grant, so something that I applied for relatively soon after my dissertation. Um, the Consolidator grant is the sort of middle level of funding, and then you have the advanced grant. And here at the bottom, Synergy grant, that's with multiple principal investigators, and proof of concept grant is something mainly for, I think, the for sciences, if you want to start a business um, with your research, which unfortunately doesn't work for research on Athonite monasticism. So let's move on. So, what are some of the benefits of these grants? I mean, aside from getting a nice press release on a university website, like I showed you. Well, one thing that we're starting to see more of is in job ads when they talk about acquiring successful third-party funding. I can say from my experience in Germany, this is now a big part of what a professor does, is to apply for these grants. And occasionally you will see specific wording talking about the potential to acquire an ERC grant. This was a job ad for a professorship in Vienna in the field of migration and mobility, and it says here potential for successfully acquiring an ERC starting grant or an ERC consolidator grant. So it's not common, but you do occasionally see this wording for job ads. Uh, Giving an example from my home institution of the University of Munich, there is a scheme whereby if you have an ERC starting grant, you can contact a member of a faculty in Munich, and they can apply to create a professorship for you. This used to actually be a scheme for basically anyone who had an ERC starting grant had a very good chance of getting this thing. Now it's more difficult. I guess that's inflation, you could say. But it still exists, and it's a way of creating professorships in a field in which we don't have that many permanent positions, right? So this is a very attractive scheme from that standpoint. And I'll mention another scheme similar that's offered by the Catholic University of Louvain. Again, where you bring a grant to the university and they give you a tenure track or tenured professorship. And a similar scheme is also offered by an Italian university, Ca' Foscari. Again, you bring your grant with you to the university, and they give you either a tenure track or tenured professorship. This is all just to say that there are benefits to ERC grants not only for the field, it's a very good thing to do for Byzantine studies or for whatever field you work in, but it can also be personally beneficial to you. Um, and this is one of the reasons for this is because grants, ERC grants, are not tied to an institution. They're tied to the principal investigator. So as the grantee, if you decide you have better working conditions at another institution, you can simply take the grant with you. Um, and for instance, I did this myself with the MAMEMS project. I was initially at the University of Mainz, and then when I was hired in Munich, I brought the project with me for the last year of the funding period. So what type of research projects are supported by the ERC? This is something I think that particular people from the humanities struggle with because in the older documentation, the wording has been changed slightly. There was talk of, quote, high risk and high gain research. So research that has a high probability of failure, but at the same time, a high probability of producing something very innovative and new and groundbreaking. There's a lot of this sort of cutting edge, groundbreaking um, uh, uh, language in the ERC documentation. And you might say, well, I'm an archaeologist and I'm, you know, I'm working at excavation sites. How is that high risk, high gain? And that is a problem I think that we in the humanities have to deal with more than say a nuclear physicist who's maybe building a fusion reactor that might not work at all, but if it does work, it can change energy policy. You can't use the same sort of examples in Byzantine studies or in the humanities, but still, I think it's important to present your project as something new and different. Um, Another point I would bring up about choosing a topic for an ERC project is it should be something that speaks to scholars beyond your own field. And that's very different than I think when you apply for a project with a national funding agency. And I'm speaking here from my experience with the German scholarly foundation, the DFG. Usually in these national funding agencies, they send your proposal to other specialists. But with ERC, your project will be judged by a panel, and in a panel of say 12 people, maybe there are only one or two people working directly in the field or in a related field. So your proposal will be read by people who are working on, let's say, 20th century British history, or 16th century Chinese history, or Latin American archaeology, pre-Columbian archaeology, something like that. So you have to write a proposal that will not only convince specialists, but I think even more importantly, can speak to a general audience. And last but not least, and this applies to all applications and it's not really insightful, but just you should have very clear goals about what you want to do. And I'll talk about how I tried to articulate that with MAMEMS. So again, I'll just go briefly through the parts of an ERC application, and then I will get into MAMEMS specifically. Um, when you write one of these applications, you have to pick a panel that fits your topic. In my case, it was SH6, Science and Humanities 6, the study of the human past. And the application itself consists of two parts, part B1 and part B2. Part B1 is, you can say it's an extended synopsis of the project. The actual description of what you want to research is only 5 pages, so it's very short. And the rest of it is your CV, an appendix on other grants, and sort of early achievements that you've had as a scholar. Early achievements track record, it was called, for the ERC starting grant. So in total, including the foot and endnotes, which don't count as part of the proposal, the entire B1 part of the application is maybe only 10 to 12 pages. It's extremely short. Um, and here, space is really at a premium to convince your readership that you have a great project. The second part of the proposal, the scientific proposal, is part B2. This should be directed more at specialists. It's 15 pages long. And here you can go into more detail about the methodology, about the sources, that sort of thing in the project. Just here briefly, some tips. I've already gone over for B1 that you should use the limited space that you have, and B1 is directed in particular at non-specialists, and B1 is also judged in both rounds of the application process. So there's a first round that if you pass, you get invited to an interview, and in both parts of the application process, B1 is read, whereas B2 is only used for the second round. This is, I think, the last part of the sort of mechanics, the nitty-gritty of applying for these ERC projects, because this is also a very important part of the application process, the oral presentation. So what I've been discussing so far is the written proposal, but if you pass the first round, you are invited to give an oral presentation of your project. And I've had the experience of doing this before and after COVID. And before COVID, you were invited to Brussels and you presented the project at the ERC headquarters in downtown Brussels. But since COVID, they got used to um, having online presentations, and I think that also obviously was a cost-saving measure. And now, as far as I know, all of the presentations are online. And here as well, you have very limited space, in this case, time to present your project. The first time I did it, you had 10 minutes to present the project, and when I did it most recently, I had 5 minutes. So again, it's almost an absurdly short amount of time to present a complex topic, but you just present the sort of highlights of what you want to do. Um, they're very strict with the time limit, so if you speak even a second over your time limit, they'll just cut you off. You're not allowed to say anything. It's not like a typical academic conference where there's a lot of indulgence, economia, let's say, given to people who speak longer. Um, and it is expected that you speak without a script or notes, which I know in the humanities is still unusual. I usually have a script when I speak, when I give an academic paper, and that takes some getting used to. Um, Oftentimes, you can anticipate potential criticism of a project by sharing it with other people, with colleagues. And in my experience, usually what my colleagues and friends have said about the weak points of the project are also what the committee will ask about. Usually, I think it's the same points. Um, the last point in this part of the presentation I wanted to mention is that the composition of the panel, so who are the panel members, stays roughly the same every 2 years. So if you look at who was on your panel 2 years ago, probably 70-80% of the same people will be there when you do it. So um, that is just sort of a brief overview of what ERC projects are, some tips for applying for them. I'd be happy to talk about more of this in the discussion. But now I think most of you are actually interested in Athos and in how this works in practice. And at this point, I would just like to give sort of the history of my own project, of this MAMEMS project, and how I made it into an application, and then it's been working since it's been funded. So I didn't in my scholarly career, I wrote my dissertation on Byzantine law, so I didn't begin as an Athos specialist. Um, of course, we all deal with Athenite documents. Those of us who work in Byzantine and Ottoman studies, right? They're really omnipresent in Byzantine studies. If you want to do something about the fiscal administration, let's say, or peasant society in late Byzantium, you have to use Athenite documents. So even though Byzantinists know about the Athos archives, and we all appreciate the Athenite archives, I thought what was missing was sort of putting Athos itself at the center of Byzantine history and seeing how you could follow Byzantine history through the example of one place, sort of a microcosm. I mean, as is often done in history, right? You pick a city, you pick a particular place, and write a history of a particular time period based on only that one place, microhistory. And my idea for doing this was not to write a new history of Mount Athos, which is something, by the way, that very much needs to be done. And actually, there are people in the room who would be, I think, well suited to writing a new, good scientific history of Mount Athos. My idea for doing this was to create an Athenite prosopography, so an index of people who are associated with the Holy Mountain. And um, one here I was thinking of the ERC's notion that research needs to be high risk, high gain. And with an Athenite prosopography, there are some foundational works that you can use that are very good. I mean, here on the right, I'm listing all the eras where we have a prosopography, a general prosopography for Byzantine studies. And for instance, for the first phase of the project, we have the so-called PM-Bezet, the prosopography of the Middle Byzantine period. Fantastic prosopography, very well done, very thorough. We have then this prosopography of the Byzantine world for the following period, which is less thorough and doesn't include all the Athenite material. And then for almost 100 years, we have a gap where we have no general prosopography for the whole Byzantine world. And then for the late period, we have the prosopographical lexicon of the Paleologan era, which, however, only includes Greek sources. So for all the Slavonic material, that's not there. So as you can see, there were these gaps for doing this prosopography. There were also gaps in the source material for the existing prosopographical resources. So there was a lot to be done, but also there was enough of a groundwork where we weren't starting from nothing. I think if we would have had to create an Athonite prosopography from nothing, it wouldn't be possible in 5 years, and maybe not in 10, 15 years. So what sort of material do we have from Athos? Um, these are just very rough figures. But for Greek, we have over 1,000 legal documents that are published actually in very good scientific editions in the Archive de l'Athos, as we all know, and Costis is a part of this initiative. Um, we have a lot of material, not as much as in Greek, but also very important in Church Slavonic, mainly from Hilandar, so from the Serbian monastery, but not only on Athos. About 200 legal documents. This material is not as well edited and not as well researched as the Greek material. Then we have the Ottoman documents, and I wrote here 15,000. I have no idea how much Ottoman material there is because most of it isn't cataloged, and we just don't know, and it depends on what time period you choose. This was one of the hardest parts of the project because we didn't have a full-time Ottomanist. So we had a person that we did work contracts to do Ottoman entries for the database. But I think in retrospect, if I would have had more money, I would have maybe extended it to 1600 and had a full-time Ottomanist on the project. But you have to deal with the resources you have. The Georgian material, I'll talk more about this when I talk about the commemorative lists. There isn't that much Georgian material from Athos when you compare it to the Greek and Slavonic material. However, for the early period, it's immensely important. So we have this Synodicon, this Agape book um, from Aviron, and also we have a lot of Georgian manuscripts that were copied on Athos that are either still in Iviron or are in other libraries, for instance, in Georgia today. And then in other languages, Latin, Arabic, there are a few documents. I mean, not that many. The Latin documents are a very interesting part, I think, of the Athonite archives. But yeah, that's more important for the early modern period, I would say. So far, what I've been giving, what I've been presenting, this is perhaps interesting to specialists, and it would be an important contribution to the discipline, but it's not really the sort of groundbreaking aspect is missing, right? I mean, this is material we know about, even if, for instance, when we're talking about the Ottoman documents for Athos, that's not really well researched, but the rest of it is relatively well known to Byzantinists and to people in other fields. And where we thought that we would do something that was new and innovative was to look at commemorative lists from Athos. Those of you who have had anything to do with medieval studies, if you study medieval France, medieval Germany, and especially monasticism or the church, you know that the commemoration of the dead, this is a really important part of medieval studies. So looking at memorial lists from, say, monasteries, who is commemorated, why, sort of the social composition of the commemorandi. Um, and these lists also exist for the Byzantine world. But in contrast to what we have in medieval studies, they're not well studied. Um, and for instance, from Athos, and I hope to publish, I wrote a study recently cataloging all the lists that I could find from Athos. And there are, depending on how you count them, there are at least 14 that were written mainly in the early modern period. that we find either in the published catalogs or also in this online repository of Athonite documents, which is incomplete, but still you can find some things there that are interesting. Um, and so the idea for the project for MAMEMS was, well, to make this prosopography, we could also use these commemorative lists, um, which are almost completely unstudied in the Greek tradition. In Georgian and Slavonic, it's a little bit different, and I'll come to them in a second. So I said these lists are not well studied in the Greek tradition. Well, maybe what do they look like? Um, Here's an example. So this is an early modern list from Protaton. So from the sort of administrative monastery on Athos. And you can see some of the general characteristics of what they look like. Um, I hope that that is sort of visible. And maybe I can use, is there like a laser pointer type thing? Yes, here. I think this is a laser pointer. 1 second. Or highlighter. Oh, you can see the cursor? Oh, that's perfect. Okay. But you can see here, hopefully, Ravion, which is a common. These lists have different names, and I don't know. It'd be interesting to discuss maybe in the Q&A section why they have certain names and not others. Prothesis or prothesy is also a a designation you see a lot. I'm not sure there's a rhyme or reason why one term is used over another. Kuvaras, I've also seen. There are many different designations in the Greek tradition. And depending on the list, they sometimes have categories. So here you see here in red this rubric, the category of the founders, ton titoron. And then maybe you can see the names Nicephorus, John, Johannes, and Athanasius. And this commemorates the founders of actually the Athonite monastic community, right? The emperors Nicephorus Phocas, John Thimiskis, and Athanasius the Athonite, the founder of the Great Labra. And that's just one example. These lists look very differently depending on which monastery they're in and what period they come from. But that's just one example to give you sort of a general idea of what the Greek lists look like. One thing I will say about the Greek lists that's interesting is the Greek tradition of keeping lists of the deceased to be commemorated is a relatively late development uh, because the examples we have from the Byzantine era tend to be very haphazard. So names that are kept in the margins of liturgical manuscripts, for instance, like a liturgical calendar. We have an example from the Prodromos Monastery from the late 13th, early 14th century. That's also just a list of names. And that's the other feature of them. They tend to be relatively simple. They're just names. For instance, this list of founders here, they are designated as emperors, but oftentimes you don't have titles or dates, things like that. And to say nothing of where these people came from, what did they give to be commemorated? Also an interesting question. We don't have that in the Greek tradition, as far as I know. It's very different when we come to the Georgian tradition, which is actually the oldest memorial tradition, I would say, in Byzantium, but particularly on Athos. And the outstanding example, of course, is this book of commemorations. It's often called Synodikon, which is actually a misnomer. I can explain that in a Q&A maybe. This book of commemorations, or agapes, an agape is a memorial meal feast given in honor of the deceased. And the agape book is very different from the list we just saw because it gives not only the name of the deceased, but also what they gave to be commemorated. So maybe they gave gold, maybe they gave land, maybe they exercised influence at court. And also, this Georgian list will talk about what memorial acts are to be done in honor of the deceased. How many measures of wine does each monk get, for instance? Interesting. What liturgies are to be celebrated at which churches at Iviron? All these sorts of things. So the Georgian list is a complete outlier when we compare it to the other Athenite lists we have. There are other Georgian lists like this from later in the Middle Ages. There's one from the Monastery of the Holy Cross in Jerusalem, and I believe there's one from Sinai as well, but I think that one might be early modern. Um, in both cases, though, in both these other cases, they're not as I think information as informative as the list we have here from Eviron, which, by the way, is no longer in Eviron. It's today in the Georgian capital of Tbilisi at the National Manuscript Center. When we come to the commemorative lists in Slavonic, it's they're more like the Greek tradition in that they are primarily just names. Um, and the So for the project, allow me to say first of all that although this book is known to Byzantinists and scholars have used it, and there's even a French overview of the various agapes in the Archive de l'Athos. One thing we want to do for the project is create a new edition and translation of this text. So for scholars who can't read Georgian, it's accessible, and hopefully that will appear fairly soon here with the end of the project. I mean, I've seen the text, and it's in good shape, and I think it will be a major achievement. We're doing the same thing for this Slavonic list, which comes from Hilandar. It is just barely a medieval list from around the year 1500. It comes from the tower slash chapel of St. George, which used to be an independent foundation, but its archive ended up in the monastery of Hilandar. And this commemorative list, as I said, is more like what we saw with the Greek example. So it's primarily just names. Um, and as Here as well, we have a different designation for what the list is called. Pomenik is used, or pomenki in the plural, is usually what scholarship uses to talk about these lists. Here you can see pomenovania, all these words are related to the root for memory. So this idea of keeping the memory of the deceased alive. Um, and then you just have names in the genitive case. Yeah, Simeona Monacha, Anastasiou Monachi, and so forth. And on the first page of this list, the first folio, as you see here, these are actually Serbian royalty. So these are kings and queens of Serbia. You also hear you see Tsar, Tsara, um, so these are important people. Therefore, you would expect them at the front of the list. But you don't, unlike with the Greek list we saw you don't have a category on each page saying this is royalty, these are founders, these are bishops. Um, and With this list, I can already say our Slavicist who has been working on the project, Kiro Maximovich, he's discovered that there's a lot of repetition. So apparently the names were copied over and over again, and the scribe didn't realize that he had copied the same list of names twice. And sometimes you get repetitions of the same, let's say, five, six, seven names over and over again over several folios. So there are a lot of kind of mistakes built into the list. Which is in and of itself interesting because this indicates that this list is actually the end product of what were probably very many smaller lists or early editions of this commemorative list. So, as with the Georgian list, there will also be an edition translation of this list. I mean, translation might not seem so useful because it's just a list of names, but again, if you don't know Slavonic, then it's an important thing to do. So yeah, I would say, this was the sort of high risk part of the project. Looking at these commemorative lists, doing something that hasn't, to my knowledge, really been done in Byzantine studies, to mine these commemorative lists for historical information and to put them in the database. So alongside the published sources, which we know about and are in good editions, also to include these names from commemorative lists. We also wanted to have um, conferences, so three conferences in this case, and each conference would be developed to would be devoted to a different topic, wealth, ethnicity, and gender. And some of you in this room have been involved with these conferences actually. And the edited volume for the first conference has actually just appeared. I'll talk about that more later. So that's how I sort of conceptualized the project. And now I would like to move on and talk about some of the challenges and successes of the project. Challenges. A challenge that I would have to mention at the very beginning, and it works in terms of timing because we have the 5 year anniversary now of the appearance of COVID in Europe and the and basically the shutdown that happened as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is something we had to deal with at the beginning of the project because right as I was hiring people and trying to assemble a team, COVID happened. And I know it was different in every country, but in Germany, there were very strict restrictions about how many people could sit in a room together, for instance. We couldn't meet as a group in person for the first year of the project. So we very early on, we had to adjust to sort of this online routine of working which of course isn't unique to this project. We all had to deal with that in various forms. But it was, I have to say, it was a particular challenge with a project where you have only a limited amount of time and sort of big things are expected. So we had to deal with that. We had to adjust the conference schedule because we couldn't hold an in-person conference for the first couple of years of the project. And actually, the first conference we did was online still, even though it was in the second year of the COVID pandemic. And it wasn't until the third conference that we had a sort of hybrid conference um, where half the participants were online and half were in person. And by the time we did the last conference, which was actually organized with a Byzantinist who's associated with the school, Olivier de Louis, in Oxford, that was a fully in-person conference. But that was 2023, so it took a while. I know some of you are interested, particularly in the digital part of this, and I'm actually don't have that much in terms of slides to show you as to what this database looks like. But yeah, if you ever see one of these network analyses, right, or things that my colleague Johannes Preiser Capello writes, you see these nodes, and this is what the database looks like right now in a visual representation. And adapting to to a digital infrastructure was and is actually the database isn't complete. It's one of the biggest challenges of the project because I mean I'm not that old yet, but I wasn't when I went to graduate school, digital humanities was still sort of in its infancy. I mean it was people basically writing things in an Excel spreadsheet and then hoping that it could be put online in some form. And now what's being done is much more sophisticated. And the database that we have, and there is a beta version that you can use actually. It's not complete, but you can sort of see what it looks like. Um, it's on the MAMEMS website. Uh, so it's been a big challenge to adapt historical material to a digital interface because, for instance, when you use data, I mean, one problem we often have, data has to be very precise. So you have to say, I mean, maybe you have a mention of a person, and this is most of the people in the database actually, a name that's mentioned in one Athonite act, Johannes or something like that, a John. And then you don't know anything else about this person. Maybe he's John the monk, maybe you know that much, but you don't know if he's the same John the monk that's mentioned in an act 15 years later from the same archive. Um, and so in a database, though, a database wants to know, well, when did this person live? Exactly when? Give us precise dates. And that's just one example, but it's been challenging to put precise parameters on things where we don't have a lot of information. for the vast majority of the people that we're talking about. Since I know some of you are interested in digital humanities, I can maybe talk more about that in the Q&A session. One thing that often happens too with these projects, it's not a bad thing, it's important for the publicity of the project, is you then get asked to write, about your subject for other research initiatives. And I've been asked to do that for several different publications, and I've enjoyed doing it, and I've learned more about other things and about Athos that way. But it does take away from sort of the core time of the project, working on the database, what have you. That's just um, something to be aware of. Last but not least, and those of you who have dealt with Athos have perhaps had this experience. Um, we were not able to get access to a list that we really wanted to edit, um, which is a commemorative list that is housed at the Great Lavra, so the principal monastery, the highest ranking monastery on Athos. This list has been described in scholarship since the end of the 19th century, but I suspect this is only a theory, and at least it's based on what I've been able to find about people who have described the manuscript. I'm not sure if any scholar has actually seen this list since the beginning of the 20th century. Um, so there was a scholar who described it in the 70s based on a photocopy of a handwritten copy of the list. So these chains of transmission. Um, that is to say, this list it's very hard to get access to it, even though we know it's at the Great Lavra. We requested to look at it. We didn't get access. And in the end, we weren't able to edit this list, which would have been great. Instead, we decided to edit an older Greek list. As I said about 20 minutes ago, these Greek commemorative lists from Athos, most of them come from the early modern period. And that's the case also with the Svatopedi list, which was used in the period from 1715 to 1867. And this is the third commemorative list that we're editing for the project. Even though, however, it is an early modern product, it does appear to contain medieval names. I don't want to say anything now with certainty, but there are some, for instance, late Byzantine titles that you find in the list that either fit a Byzantine context or were titles that were also used in the context of the of Moldavia and Wallachia in the early modern period. So that was another challenge. We had to switch the list that we wanted to look at. So yeah, this is where we are with publications. You can see here the cover of this medieval Mount Athos Between Wealth and Poverty, which I think ended up being a very nice edited volume. We're now well along the way with the second one, which deals with this question of ethnicity and cultural identity. And last but not least, we have this gender volume that is planned. They're all appearing in the medieval Mediterranean list series rather. And that's also where these three commemorative lists will appear. I've already been talking for a long time, but I promised to say something about insights from the MAMEMS project. And I just wanted to very briefly do that now at the end. Um, so one thing that I had already talked about, but I think is well demonstrated, was a success in the project, is looking at Mount Athos as a microcosm or as a microhistory. I think you can do that. Maybe Athos is unique in the Byzantine world. I'm not sure if you could I mean, you could do Constantinople, and Constantinople is maybe the only other place you could do this. Thessaloniki, perhaps, as well. But there aren't a lot of places in Byzantium where we have enough, especially written material, over enough time to do a diachronic microhistory, sort of longue durée examination of a particular place. With Athos, you can do that, though, and you can write Byzantine history from a different perspective. So not from what is usually the Constantinopolitan perspective of the Byzantine state, but rather from this perspective of a holy mountain, which is completely different in many ways. So I think that's interesting. Um, Another thing that has been interesting working on the project is seeing monasticism beyond the great communal monasteries, the Kinovia. And I think that this is something that research needs to focus more attention on. What is it like living in a hermitage or skete, these smaller monastic institutions? Also, when we were talking about this earlier, also with some of the people in the audience, idiorhythmia. So what is it like, even within these great communal monasteries, when you have an idiorhythmic regime where you can own property, you have a council governing the monastery instead of an abbot, etc. I think also when you write from this Athonite perspective, you get a different idea of periodization, so how you should organize historical periods. The fall of Constantinople, while also important for Athos, in the sense that the emperor no longer is the person who regulates the internal affairs of the Athonite monasteries when there's no more Byzantine emperor, right? At that point, the patriarch steps in and is able to issue then general typica for Athos, something that Manuel II was the last Byzantine emperor to do. It is a caesura, the fall of Constantinople for Athos as well. But I do think that with Athos, because it was incorporated into the Ottoman state so early, I mean, already with the first occupation of Macedonia, the first Ottoman occupation at the end of the 14th century, and then more permanently at the beginning of the 15th century, Athos is already, in some form, dealing with the Ottomans very early on, before the fall of Constantinople. And there's a lot of institutional continuity after the fall of the city as well. So, from the Athonite perspective, there's a question of, well, does this separation between late Byzantium or the Ottoman period, how much sense does that make? And I think that that's something that also fits very well, by the way, with the seminar, the topic of the seminar that's been organized here. And last but not least, I think this Athos research has been important for shifting the focus of Byzantine studies itself from a fixation on the Byzantine state. The early interest in Athos from Byzantinists, and I can speak, for instance, of some of my predecessors in the chair of the Byzantine studies in Munich, like Franz Doger. They were mainly interested in Athonite documents as collections of information on Byzantine fiscal practice, for instance, how taxes were collected, how villages and persons were registered on tax rolls, that sort of thing. And from this Athonite microcosm perspective, I think you get a different view of Byzantine studies that's not focused on the survival and character of the Byzantine state. Those are just some general insights from the project. Again, we can talk about that more in the discussion. But with that, I would like to thank you for your attention and look forward to your questions.